What if the Reconquista failed?
For those of you who don't know, the Reconquista was when the Christians drove the Muslims out of Iberia, of which they controlled almost all of. This lasted over 700 years from the mid-8th century to 1492 and took up almost all of Spain's medieval history. Today, by European standards, Iberia is small and poor, and so it's hard to imagine it ever having a massive effect on world history. Yet Spain practically created the Latin America we know today, as well as almost conquering the entirety of Europe several times over, while Portugal helped create the age of exploration in the Indian Ocean we know today. And so the alternate history question to ask would be, what if the Reconquista failed? What if the Muslims remained in control of Iberia, and Spain and Portugal never existed? What would the borders be like? What would culture be like? That is the question of this alternate history. The best way to prevent the Reconquista from ever happening would be to snuff it out in the beginning. In the mid-8th century, after the Muslim conquest of Iberia, the last of the Visigoths fled north into the mountains of Asturias. The Muslims followed them there, and the Battle of Covadonga followed. The Christians at that point defeated the Muslims and maintained independence in northern Spain in our timeline. A Muslim victory at Covadonga would allow the Muslims to take control of Asturias, but to prevent the Christians from simply rebelling again when the caliphate was weak, they would have to completely obliterate the Visigothic nobility and leadership at Covadonga. This would be similar to the Battle of Hastings, which completely destroyed the Anglo-Saxon nobility and leadership, and allowed the long-term Norman rule of England. This would leave all Iberia in Muslim hands, except for the Basque territories in the north, which no one conquered in our timeline until the 16th century, and this is unlikely that anyone would conquer it in this timeline, except for Catalonia, which just like our timeline would be conquered by Charlemagne in the late 8th century. In this timeline, Catalonia might well be part of southern France. This actually isn't very unlikely, mainly because until the mid-11th century in our timeline, Catalonia was part of the domain of the Duke of Toulouse. And so, in a world where it was one of the few Christian states in Spain, it's unlikely for them to stay with Toulouse, but on the other hand, it might simply become its own country, just like in our timeline. The demographics of Spain in this timeline would be radically different from ours. This is because in our timeline, the Castilians, or the most powerful of the Spanish kingdoms, when they conquered Muslim lands, they took it away from the local Muslim farmers, and they gave it to the North Spanish Christian farmers instead. And since there was so much land to go around, the North Spanish Christian farmers simply became ranchers. And this is why Spain has such a low population density. And also the destruction of the Muslim farmers is why most Spaniards look very European and not very Middle Eastern. And so, if the Reconquista never happened, this trend never would have happened. And so, Spain would have had a much denser population density in this timeline, and its population would look much more Middle Eastern and much less European. In our timeline, in the early Middle Ages, Spain was one of the centers of Islamic civilization. Cordoba was one of the largest cities in the world, and the Umayyad caliphs sponsored the arts and culture. And so, if the Christians never reconquered Iberia, it wouldn't be unlikely that it would likely remain like this, a center of Islamic civilization on par with Egypt, Syria, or Persia. There would likely be no further Islamic conquests into Europe, mainly because the Umayyad caliphs weren't really into expansion, and we see this is very evident in their history. But also, the Mediterranean between the 10th, I know that's a tentative number, and the 14th century was basically a European lake, and the Muslims had very little naval power there, and so it's unlikely they could launch a naval attack across the Mediterranean. Just like in our timeline, the Caliphate of Cordoba would collapse in the 11th century into small taifa, or princeling states. In our timeline, Muslim Spain was invaded and conquered twice by the Moroccans. The more united Moroccans were able to defeat the disunited local Muslim taifa states. This would happen in this timeline as well, but the Moroccans would in the long run be unable to maintain control over the peninsula with their much smaller population for an extended period of time. This would create a seesaw of power on the peninsula between the independent taifas and the Moroccans, lasting many years. In the early 16th century, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and France fought extremely bloody wars over the control of Italy called the Italian Wars. In this timeline, without the Spanish to counterbalance the French would conquer Italy and defeat the Holy Roman Empire in the early 16th century. This would make France far too powerful, and thus driving the balance of power way off. This would create balance of power wars as the rest of Europe would team up against France. The main reason that the Pope would not let Henry VIII annul his marriage with Catherine of Aragon was that she was Spanish royalty. Since the Spaniards were the puppet masters of much of Italy, the Pope did not want to anger them by annulling the marriage. In this timeline, Henry VIII would probably be married to some minor German princess to help defeat the French hegemony, and this would be a marriage that the Pope would likely be okay with annulling, since the French in this timeline would be the puppet masters of Italy. Thus, in this timeline, England would remain Catholic without Henry VIII's need for a divorce. The merchant classes of eastern England would likely still become Protestant, mainly because Protestantism was very attractive for merchants, since it allowed them to charge interest. 100 years later, in the English Civil War, both sides would be officially Catholic, but the parliamentarians would be heavily reliant upon Protestants. This would be because the parliamentarian base in eastern England would have a large Protestant population, and the Protestants were very in favor of the parliamentarian cause. And so when the parliamentarians would win the war, they would enact a don't ask, don't tell Protestant policy. A main reason for the removal of the Stewarts from the British crown and their replacement with Germans was that the majority of England's population was Protestant, while the Stewarts were Catholic. Thus, if England was a Catholic country, the Stewarts would have remained in power. The Stewarts were very against unity between Scotland and England, since much of their support came from Scotland, and Scotland was against unification. It was only through lots of very complicated Scottish history, which I don't have time to explain, and will explain in the description if you want, did the unification of Great Britain take place. In this timeline, Scotland would remain an ally of England, and would have a unity of crowns, but would still have a separate government. The Low Countries have a very complicated early modern history, which I will condense down for you to less than a minute. So, the region was originally controlled by the Duke of Burgundy, but in 1477, the Burgundian duchy collapsed due to a succession crisis. The region was then given to Austria, who, having another succession crisis, handed over to Spain. But then the northern half of the territories revolted and became the Netherlands we know today, while the southern half remained true to Spain and became Belgium. Thus, if Spain never existed, the Low Countries would have remained Austrian. This would make it much easier for the Dutch to rebel and assert their independence earlier, since the Austrians would not have the force of the Spanish Empire behind them, and also the Austrians aren't really known for their military prowess either. In our timeline, the power given to the Austrians by their union of crowns with Spain let them keep much of Germany Catholic, but in this timeline, more of Central Europe would be Protestant without the power of the Spanish Empire. The reason the 30 Years' War was so long was that the Habsburgs had the endless resources of the Spanish Empire that could keep the war going year after year after year with more funds. But without the Spanish, the war would likely end much earlier, with the Imperials simply running out of steam. This would likely come in the form of Gustavus Adolphus's invasion of southern Germany, with the Austrians signing a favorable treaty giving the Swedes great influence and territories in northern Germany. This would make Sweden a great power of the 17th century. Whether or not this power would last past the rise of Russia and Prussia, I can't tell you, though. In our timeline, the Iberian Nations were the engines of the Age of Exploration. The Muslims showed very little interest in the Atlantic, and so would the Age of Exploration commence without the nations of Spain and Portugal? The Dutch would likely round the Cape of Good Hope, since they would get independence much earlier, and their interest in trade would lead them to want to create a link with the Indies, and thus around the Cape of Good Hope. This would likely lead to a Dutch Indian Ocean Empire, the long-lasting nature of which I'm unable to predict, since in our timeline the Dutch Empire was destroyed by the Anglo-Dutch Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, both of which are events I can't predict here. Ocean currents forced ships going around the Cape of Good Hope to strike out from the African coast to prevent from being smashed by the harsh African currents. This is how the Portuguese discovered Brazil. One of their ships struck too far out in the Atlantic and reached Brazil. The Dutch, likely taking a similar route, would likely discover and also colonize Brazil in this timeline. England would likely discover America by default. The French would be busy fighting hegemonal balance of power wars and Protestant Catholic civil wars. The Dutch would be busy in the Indian Ocean, and the Scots and Irish would be too poor, leaving only England. The 13 colonies would be founded much earlier in this timeline, but the process of their foundation would be very similar to our own timeline, with Protestants seeking religious freedom in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, while Catholic Cavaliers and Scots-Irish settling in the South. Since the English would reach the Americas first, they would conquer the fabulously wealthy Aztec Empire and the Mayan city-states. A major reason, but not the only reason why the last 200 years have not been kind to Mexico, has been the Spanish treated it like a helicopter parent. The Spanish gave no autonomy to the native inhabitants, and so when they left, the Mexicans couldn't agree on what government to choose. This led to civil wars and regime changes that last to this day. Yet, with a looser English rule form, these locals would have autonomy, and thus they would be prepared for when Britain would lose control of the region. Perhaps in this timeline, Mexico would be even more powerful than the United States, since it would have a larger and more urbanized base to start with. Meanwhile, in South America, the Inca would remain independent from England since they would simply be too far away to be conquered. An often forgotten part of history is that in the late 16th century, the Huguenots established a colony in what is now Florida. This colony was, in the long run, crushed by the Spanish, but in this timeline, without the Spanish, it would survive. The major reason the Quebec colony did not encapsulate the entire North American continent was that it didn't have a large enough population. This was because it didn't attract families, because it didn't allow the religious heretics that populated much of the English colonies. Thus, the only people who ended up coming were trappers in the form of veterans and priests to spread Christianity. Meanwhile, the Florida Huguenot colony would thrive and would grow in a large population because it would attract families seeking religious freedom. With this self-replicating base, the Huguenot colony of Florida and Georgia would have a large population that would not be conquered in the 7 Years' War, thus making the Deep South culturally French in this timeline. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this timeline, please comment or subscribe. What if Altist? Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for my next alternate history, What if Hitler invaded Russia?